back to that idea that Paul Parma is saying is, if you don't have the stranger in your church, how are you going to learn to do that? How are you going to know what it's like to be homeless or to be a single mom or to be, living paycheck to paycheck, going to the food bank if you've never done that? And yet, if you have a person like that in your church, learn from them, speak to them, have them be part of your family and your home. And as you get to know them, you begin to learn that language. You begin to learn the thickness of that narrative. And then you're equipped because you've experienced it. And together, you've come to create the goodness of community in Jesus, even though you are strangers. And then in that way, when you go out, people smell it on you. Like, oh, you look like you're, middle class and you live in a nice home in the suburbs, but why do I smell homelessness on you? Like, why do I smell displacement on you? Why do I smell, single mom mindedness? Like, how do you know these things? And it's because you carry the community with you, right? It becomes part of who you are, and it creates a thick understanding of the gospel and a thick experience of it, which then allows you to engage with these thick narratives of the people in the public. And so I think it is a matter of ethnicity breaking out of those kind of ethnic enclaves, but really it's an understanding of ecclesiology, right? And discipleship. Like, how are we being discipled? How are we being trained? How are we being raised up in our churches for this work of the public? I think that's really the bigger question.
When I hear that, I also hear too, is that because we only sometimes have the capacity to have a thin theology engaging with the thick culture, even not only like the four spiritual laws, like proclamation, kind of evangelism type of one-dimensional way of engaging, but many of us in our like university years or exploration of faith, we discover something that is perhaps opposite to that, proclamation thing, and we go hard on the other way, where we're like, in reaction to that, conservative way of doing things, we convert not to a more full, thick version, but we go to another very particular narrow way of doing things that might just be only action based or only, doing good deeds or whatnot. That is in reaction to that. I found that happened to me as well. And again, but it's the same thing. We just start engaging the world in a very thin way that's not proclamation based, but that is maybe embodied form completely, or a particular, like this is what happened in politics all the time, right? People are reacting to something and they're only functioning in that thin kind of layer of it, rather than engaging of this and this together. I'm adding to my understanding of how to engage multiple ways instead of just saying only this angle of it. And I think that's something to always be careful for, of how reactionary we are to that, and forming other very particular ways of engaging a thick understanding. Because that's what we do. Like, as you're saying that, I'm like, yeah, I've had many situations where, because it's too thick, I'm waiting for it to filter down, or I'm trying to find a segue to make it back into my own thin way of understanding it. So I steer the conversation that way. And I've done that in many different narrow ways of doing things in order to make someone's complexity fit within my simple solutions, right?
Yeah. And I think going along with that, just the idea of the Holy Spirit, right? Like why God gave us the Holy Spirit. And I think the
Yes.
Holy Spirit
Yeah.
is
Holy Spirit.
what helps us, like he's thick, it's the thickness that we're looking for. It comes in the Holy Spirit because it's saying God is giving his spirit that helps us to know the things on God's mind. So we're getting a peek into greater knowledge, like greater experience, greater understanding of narratives, because we have God's spirit inside of us, right? And I always look at the picture of, Pentecost in Acts. And I know a lot of people look at that picture of Pentecost as an image of multiculturalism, right? Like, look, they all suddenly spoke different languages. And, that's what we need to do. We need to get people of every language in the church. And we almost try to fabricate that. Like, okay, we need to have, an Asian on the board. We need to have a, Caucasian on the board. We need someone from every ethnicity on the board. And we try to fabricate it. But when we look at the picture of Pentecost, like if we were to look into that room, all those people look the same. They were monocultural people, right? It could have been a room full of Koreans, a room full of Indonesians. They weren't all multicultural. And yet it says that when they longed to really do the work of God and they waited upon him, that the Holy Spirit came, and through the Holy Spirit, each of them suddenly broke out into the tongues that they didn't know they could speak before, right? They were speaking languages that were foreign to them. And so it's this picture of how you can take something that is monocultural and very simple and maybe thin, but then through the Holy Spirit, you're almost given what you're needed, and you're equipped to be able to speak the languages that you didn't know you could speak before. And to me, I think that's the hope of this kind of needing to go to multiculturalism for the ethnic church. It's
Yeah.
not about us focusing on like how do we, on the outside make it look more multicultural, but how do we through the Spirit really be engaging with our God, who is the multicultural God, who created all things. How do we engage with him so that his Spirit, his universal
Yeah.
understanding all things Spirit comes in us and then creates in us an understanding of all things as well. So
Wow.
we were
Mhm.
given these thick narratives together, right? And I think as a church, we need to experience that. Like, how does the truth of Jesus come alive as the Spirit is in our churches and as we learn to speak different languages of all the different strangers that we may encounter? And that can only happen when we look past just ourselves and actually leave room for the stranger, right? It's
Mhm.
not going to happen if we don't.
Me and you joke that we wish we can do our PhDs orally. Um,
You know?
just
Oh, I
talk,
wish. Yeah.
because
And then if we did it together, it would have been done in like a day.
there you go. Can they just receive that instead of all this
Oh,
written work? Come
I
on,
know. Yeah, jeez.
Sarah.
Professor Sudirgo. You know what you're saying.
This is this has been rich and substantial, and yes, just externally processing with you has brought us in many places right now that has linked a lot of things together. And I think to that last point, as we bring this to a close, at that last point, I remember reading, and I give this readings to my class of Samuel Wells, that wrote this book called Improvisation. And I think when the Spirit works in us, we don't function with scripts that we have to read off of and expect someone to reciprocate in a certain way. We live in a very complex world that requires us to improvise, not just off the cuff in our head, but really through the guidance of the Holy Spirit to lead us in that. And the more that we can not just have our small group handouts or our our evangelism scripts where we are expecting this, therefore you say this. It just doesn't work like that in the world. We need to know how to engage this thick, rich culture. And so Sarah, I thank you so much for having this
This was
conversation.
fun.
You said that
Yeah.
you wouldn't be able to take me seriously on Zoom and you'd laugh
I
at my
know.
serious face, but you know what, you got through it.
I did it. I did it.
So thank you so much, Sarah.
This was great. Thanks, Jesse.